Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning. My name is Leanna. I'm the lecture coordinator for the Peninsula Seniors. Today we have Joe Martisich. He's a San Pedro native and a teacher for over 51 years. His presentation is going to be the history of your life highlighted through historical events. It'll be an interesting, humorous, and uplifting presentation designed to educate you and make you appreciate your life.
Good morning. I left teaching originally back in 1994 and then went back after having been burned out, and then went back and thought, well, I'll try to make a few extra dollars by subbing, and that's not what teachers want to do. But if you go back as a full-time replacement, where I went back and I actually worked for 6 different San Pedro High School women having babies. So as a result, I was the great-grandfather or the grandfather of the San Pedro faculty, and those 6 women had 8 children. So I was back over and over again, and it extended my teaching career for another roughly 15 years. So that's where I got that additional time in to get those 50 years plus. I've always enjoyed teaching. I remember a story that was told to me by, of all people, my accountant. We all have these philosophical gurus in our lives who are ready to give us advice at the drop of a hat. And in my case, it happens to be Harry, who does my taxes. And Harry wanted me to feel good about the state or stage of my life that I was in, so he told me that if you start life, you've got roughly 29,200 days to live. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound so bad until I started looking where I was at. Now, if you're 70, you've already had 25,500 days. And we like to talk about those days as being days spent, like money. We spend our time, and we get more bang for our buck, if you will, if we think about how we're spending it. When we're young, we don't give it that much attention. But as we get older, it becomes much more critical. I remember the great lyrics to the song, September song, about the end of the days dwindle down to a precious few. And probably all of us remember those lyrics because they're fabulous lyrics. I was really reminded of that just driving down the street the other day. I've got a 99-year-old mother who's going to be 100 next month. And thank you. And whenever I hear songs that remind me of when I was a child and my parents, it just brings out the need for a tissue or two. And it reminds me that the lyricists of the past really did fabulous, fabulous work. The introductions to songs were even better than the lyrics to the music. And in the case of September's song, I think that's pretty evident. So Harry said, well, look, figure out how many days you have left. And I figured I've got about 3,500. Now, we started out with 29,200. Now we're down to 3,500. So it's starting to grow pretty short. In fact, some of us have been around so long that we're really beginning to draw from our overdraft account. Well, what I want to do is get on with this discussion, and I've got a slide on the board, and it just sort of introduces you to what I'm going to do. I'm quoting the quotation from C.S. Lewis, who said, "We are never too old to set another goal or to dream a new dream." And I do have some goals. As a teacher, we always think about lesson plans and objectives and those things that we're required to do. And my goals are to hopefully create a new interest in history for you. Maybe we've set down a book that we enjoyed but didn't quite get through, or maybe some event happened along the way that we would like to have known more about. And some of the events that we're going to be touching on today will perhaps draw that back into your life. So some of the things that we're going to be looking at, this is just a list of things that happened during the various decades. Every decade really has a major theme, or it's built around a major problem. So for example, when we look at the 30s, of course, it was the Great Depression, and we begin to think about those hobnail boots marching through Europe and worrying about what's coming from abroad. In the 1940s, it was World War II. And how many of you actually served in the war? Did anybody serve? Very good, very good. I was too young like most of you. In fact, my fun remembrances of World War II were all the games we played, the blackouts, hearing about submarine attacks off the coast, the bombing of Los Angeles that's remembered every year down at Point Fermin Park. So those are my memories, scrap drives and war bond drives, buying my little Minuteman stamps, things of that sort, making that kind of a contributions. And we watched the events of the war happen as we went to the movie theaters. Okay, it all began with, of course, the Great Crash, and this is actually a slide that depicts January 1st, 1929. The party's still on. We didn't know what we had in store. This, again, is also a very, very famous headline from Variety, which students have been looking at in textbooks for years and years. Wall Street lays an egg. Now, this tells us that we didn't give up. The Empire State Building was built in actually was opened in 1931, so it really, as the slide title suggests, it really presents the fact that we're indomitable. We don't give up. This is one of the great pictures, photographs of the Great Depression. She's sort of the iconic person. She was found sitting in Napomo, California, with her children at the time, and just completely destitute. If you look at the picture and look at her face, you would probably imagine that she was pretty well along in age. She was only 32. By the way, she would go on and live until into her 80s and died here in California with a very large family. I think she ended up having 10 children. Now, we all go through apprenticeships, and we did ours, most of us, in the 1930s and early 40s, and this is just to suggest that in the United States, it was all about fun. Growing up was fun. In Nazi Germany, it was becoming a member of the Hitler Youth, and ultimately these two children would grow into men representing their different groups and fight each other in that awful, awful war. Now, there are those that really are not really happy about Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. If you're one of those, my purpose here is not to take one side or the other, but to suggest that something awful had happened, and that something is pretty much explained by a very famous economist of the 1930s, a man named Kuznets, who said that according to classical economics, it's okay to have a recession or a depression because it shakes the system out and the good ones hold in and the bad go out. Well, I would ask that question, was the migrant woman one of the losers? Was she one of those that didn't fit? The New Deal, again, still continues to be an issue and a problem for us today. We still argue that. We have today what we call the culture wars, where we're arguing about things like, whether or not we should salute the flag or whether or not we should have abortions or whatever. So this is just a continuation of this struggle that really began back in the 1930s with the initiation of the New Deal. Many of us benefited from it. I'm certain that if you look back at it, and I did have a slide of Al Gore and 2 or 3 other people that benefited from parts of the New Deal, or their families did. Now, 1939 was the golden year of movies. In the midst of the Depression, we still turned out an incredible number of films. Interestingly enough, I read where The Wizard of Oz actually grossed about $16 million, which was a lot of money back in those days. But you'll be astonished by the fact that Gone with the Wind grossed $400 million. Which one of those is your favorite? Did you have a favorite among those? If you're a lover of Westerns, I don't know if there's ever been a better Western than Stagecoach. Although I do have a close second. I think I really like Paul Newman's Hombre. I think that's an awfully good film as well. But who was the famous star in The Little Princess? Shirley Temple, yes. Now, when Hollywood made movies to become involved in some of the great issues around the world, they always picked the best and most recognizable stars. This really brought cachet to the film and to the issue. In this case, this is the story of the famous Spanish Civil War that was very beautifully done by Hemingway in the book, The Story For Whom the Bell Tolls. Hemingway had been a reporter there, saw it firsthand, and then decided to write the book. We all know who that person is, right? Gary Cooper. December 7th turned everything around. All of a sudden, the Depression was over. For all intents and purposes, the attack by the Japanese put America back to work. We had to pay for the war. Wars are expensive. Wars do some good things and some bad things. In fact, I've often read that if you've experienced war, it becomes the single most important part of your life, and you never apparently sometimes you just don't grow beyond that. You're stuck in that time. And that's true with our men and women that have served in Vietnam, that served in Iraq and Afghanistan, also back in Korea, because you might remember that Korea was kind of a forgotten war, and that Harry Truman got himself into a lot of trouble by calling it a police action. Now, we all participated in this. I mentioned earlier that we all bought our stamps. In mine, I can always remember those little Minuteman stamps, putting them into those bond booklets, and then when I finally had it all filled, I turned it in for an $18.75 bond, and 10 years later, they gave me back 25. Sounded like a pretty good deal. Now, we had to have fun, and as children especially, we're talking about our generation, and those of us that are in here, most of us were still really young at this time and did not have the service that some others have had. And we all remember that these were really an important part of our lives. We grew up on radio, but eventually we transitioned into television. But these are some of our favorite radio shows. I'll bet there's somebody still in here that can give you that old who's on first, what's on second, that kind of thing. Yeah, who would ever forget that? And of course, Hi-Ho Silver. Now, we also enjoyed music, and these are some of our favorite singers in the 1940s. That some of them went on into the 1950s, and I'm sure we can identify every single one of them. So starting on the upper left, that's Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby on the right, Perry Como. This next one should maybe trick you a little bit. Who? Yes, very good. The Andrews Sisters. Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree, right? And then we've got Ella Fitzgerald and the wonderful Judy Garland. Now, the war was difficult, awful, tragic. We don't have time to go through and highlight many of the events that are really important, but there are some symbolic events that remind us of the sacrifice and the difficulty of the war, and that includes this slide of the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. This ushered in the beginning of the atomic age. How many of you have a memory from back in the late or the early 50s when we could actually see the flash of the atomic bomb explosions from the desert around Las Vegas? You might remember that. And I did have an incident where my wife and I, when we had moved to Utah for a time, we met a couple that were from Overton, Utah, that both of whom were suffering from cancer, and they both lived in the area around the atomic tests. John Wayne, Susan Hayward. There were a number of actors and actresses that may very well have been afflicted by the fallout from those tests. Now, Hiroshima, of course, was the beginning of the atomic age, and we had a neighbor down on Elm Street in San Pedro who was Japanese American, served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was the most highly decorated unit of World War II, and incredibly met his wife who lived on the other side of the mountain and brought her back to the United States as a war bride. Who can ever forget that scene where we have the VJ Day kiss? And what's interesting about this slide, if you look at the right, there was always a big controversy, who was this woman and who was this man? Well, they think they resolved that, at least there's an argument for it. You can't really see it, but if you're close to this slide, you're going to looking over the sailors. His name was George Mendanza. If you look over his right shoulder, you see the face of a woman, Rita Petrie. Well, she was his date on that day. And when the news broke that the Japanese had surrendered, they both ran out into the street, and he just started grabbing women and kissing them. Now, they ended up, by the way, Rita and George ended up married, and they've been married for more than 66 years. Now, again, the photograph on the left are both George and Greta, who was the woman in the scene. It looks like she's a nurse, but it turns out that she was actually a dental technician. At the end of the war, we just really had it all. We came out of the war almost unscathed. We lost less than 500,000 people during the war, which is a lot, but when you consider that the Russians lost 28 million, it really pales in comparison, and that would be something that would be hard for the Russians to swallow because they really felt like they carried the brunt of the war. But at the end of the war in 1945, we had 2/3 of the world's industrial production. We accounted for 1/3 of the world's exports. The US dollar had replaced the British pound as the world's currency. When we also had, by the way, we were also first in the production of oil. Wouldn't that be nice today? Steel, technology, electronics, an undisputable edge in technology, and a monopoly of the atomic bomb. There was always that argument, why didn't we make the Russians dangle on the end of the string? But that's not the kind of people we are. Okay, now once the war was over, there were 16 million people that had to come back and begin the process of reconversion. So we had to find a way to do it. And at the end of World War I, the United States government didn't know what to do with the returning GIs. And by the time we got into the 1919s, 1920s, what we really have is we have recession and unemployment, a lot of adjustment problems. But in World War II, before the war ended, they decided they were going to pay the GIs. They were going to give them a gift of thanks for what they did. And that became known as the GI Bill, or the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And this, again, is President FDR signing the bill. Now, again, we can see that some of our presidents and some of our other famous people benefited from that GI Bill. This is one of the great films. If you haven't seen it for a while, go back and revisit the best years of our lives. Some of Hollywood's top actors and actresses were in the film. Dana Andrews. The fellow that you see on the right was actually in the service and lost both of his hands. And as a result, they brought him on board on the film, and he did very well. In fact, he did so well that he won the Supporting Actors Oscar in 1946 for the film. But what's interesting about this film is it really describes, or it depicts so clearly, the problems of that readjustment. In the movie, Dana Andrews plays, and I'm going to use kind of not a good term, he plays the role of a soda jerk. You know, just a guy who's working the fountain, whatever he needs to do to make the store work. He's one of the employees. He goes to war and he becomes, in effect, a hero. He goes into the Air Force. He becomes a captain. He flies a plane. The war is over and he goes back to soda jerking. This was a very, very difficult thing, and that affected millions and millions of people. Now, when we went to the movies and even early television, we really enjoyed our Westerns. And I put this slide up for a reason. I wanted to test your memory. And this time, I'm going to ask you who these two men are. Who's the man on the left? It's hard to see from where you're at. That would be a good guess, but this man played in any number of films. He was in Western after Western. That one's a tough one, so I'm going to give it to you. That's Bob Steele, who played in many, many Westerns. Now, the one on the right, you might recognize a little bit better. Tex Ritter, yes. Yes, very good. And by the way, who was his very famous son? John Ritter from Three's Company. And I absolutely love Tex Ritter's rendition in the film High Noon, when he sings the background song. It's just absolutely wonderful. Television would become one of the 2 or 3 major developments that then become a part of our lives. In this case, we're looking at people that were early on in television in the late 40s and then transitioned into the 1950s when television would leave radio way behind. On the left, I'm sure most of you, as I did, watched Ed Sullivan on Sunday evenings. It became sort of a ritual, didn't it? And then Meet the Press, which is the longest running show on television still today. I still watch it. I love Gregory on Meet the Press, and Milton Berle. Okay. This is the first telecast of a president. You can tell the size of the screen and the dimensions and the way the screen sets. I remember my first TV was a Teletone. Some of them were just weird designs. And this was broadcast from the United Nations from San Francisco. Again, television's such an important part of our lives. Now, the Red Scare, it said Second Red Scare. We might remember that there was a first. Apparently, World War I and World War II shared a lot of things in common, including fear of communism. And in 1946 and 47, we had the House Un-American Activities Committee's investigations. The most prominent, the person that became the most prominent member of the committee was Richard Nixon, who built an early career and a platform to the vice presidency by going after Alger Hiss. There's a wonderful story in here. These two guys were from different sides of the fence. Richard Nixon's family was poor, lived in Whittier, very difficult life. His father was just really irascible. He loved his mother. In fact, there's a very famous story about when his mother took his older brother, one of his older brothers, away to cure him of his tuberculosis. He signed a letter that he wrote to his mother, "Your poor dog, Richard." Now, Alger Hiss, on the other hand, came from the money side of life. He lost his father early on, but he was very, very successful and ended up going to Harvard. So we have Richard Nixon from Whittier, Alger Hiss from Harvard, and they become involved in this battle over whether or not Hiss is a communist. The end result, of course, is that he's put on trial. But there's a moment in the investigation when the House is holding one of its hearings when Nixon and Hiss pass each other in the aisle. And Hiss leans over, looks at Nixon and says, "I understand that your school was Whittier. Mine was Harvard." "Yes, I understand that your school was Whittier. Mine was Harvard." That really rubbed Nixon the wrong way. But Nixon later on in the 1970s, when he came under fire because of Watergate and the tapes, there's a recording on one of the tapes where Nixon really applauds Hiss for his sense of not being a rat. He didn't rat on anybody. And Nixon reminded his audience when that tape was being made at the time, the way he got Alger Hiss was by ratting on him. He leaked information from J. Edgar Hoover to the media. And the end result, of course, is that they actually were trying Hiss in the news. Now, this is the beginning of the national security state. The war is over. We had great hopes that we're going to be able to really have a future of great peace. The United States and the Soviets, it appeared we had buried the hatchet as allies in World War II. Wars create strange bedfellows. And it wasn't long before the alliance broke up. And a number of events happened late in the 40s that really caused great concern and caused us to really begin to look after communists even here in the United States. And we noticed on August 19th, Joe 1, that was the first explosion of a Russian atomic bomb. We thought that was going to be years away, but you might recall the famous Rosenberg trial in the 1950s based on the spy episodes in the 1940s at Los Alamos. The Chinese communists had taken control of the mainland in 1949, and by 1950, the Korean War had started. So there was a lot of concern, a lot of angst about what's going on here. Now, we had a very famous man named George Kennan who wrote a very famous document that led to what became known as the policy of containment. It also led to the development of something called NSC, National Security Council Directive 68, which set the direction, the policy for the United States for the foreseeable future, and we're in the middle of that right now. Okay, if you're, again, as one of the things I would promote in terms of this presentation, if you're really curious about NSC 68, look it up on the internet. Now, the Cold War wasn't just political, it could also be done in terms of competition, sports competition. So we fought against each other. Whoever had the most gold medals from the Olympics made their side look better. There was something called ping pong diplomacy in the 1970s that opened up Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1971. The Miracle on Ice, whoever thought the United States would beat the Russians in hockey. And my favorite was the Fischer-Spassky chess match, which I took to my class. I was teaching summer school at San Pedro High School in 1972, and with a friend we were team teaching, and we decided that we're going to bring our chess boards to class, and we're going to play some of these Spassky-Fischer matches. Kids brought their boards. We had a wonderful time. Now, television really came of age during the Kathy Fiscus story. How many of you remember Kathy Fiscus, the little girl that fell down the well? And KTLA was the first on the scene. They were a local commercial television station, and this was the beginning of really big-time television. I think the broadcast went over a period of about 3.5 days. It was a long broadcast, and eventually I think it was Stan Chambers, who was the very young television newscaster there at the time, who was on the scene, said that back in those days, television was local. Everything was local. Very much like a famous politician, Tip O'Neill, once said that politics is local. In the beginning, television was local. Joseph McCarthy took advantage of worries and fear of communism. He was running for a second term for the United States Senate. He needed an idea. Somebody suggested going after the Reds. And then he famously, at a talk at a women's club meeting in Wheeling, West Virginia, holds up a piece of paper and says, "I have in my hand the names of 205 communists working in the United States government." And boy, that started the whole McCarthy mess. The movies even made their money off of it. This is one of the really great films of the 1950s, Dr. Strangelove and How I Learned to Love the Bomb. Fear, fear, fear. That's what this was all about. There are wonderful stories about going after Arthur Miller over his stories. And of course, I think one of the things that promoted much of the interest in bringing Miller before the committees was the fact that at the time he was married to Marilyn Monroe. This is still considered the best television show of all time, the best comedy of all time. And we've all experienced it so many times and really enjoy it. Boy, the 1950s was really something. All of these personalities from left to right. Can we pick up the first guy? You were back there in 1950 when he sang his very famous Rock Around the Clock. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, rock. Well, he's on there. This is Chuck Haley and the Comets. Bill Haley. How about the guy in the middle? Fats Domino. I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill, right? And Chuck Berry, as you mentioned before. Bottom left, very good. Jerry Lee Lewis in the middle, Little Richard. Now, which one of those 6 guys doesn't belong up in that set? Nat King Cole, a different kind of music. And I have to admit that I had both feet in both camps. I was listening to rock and roll, and I was still enjoying Nat King Cole, okay? And this guy, he deserves his own slide. You ain't nothing but a hound dog. Elvis Presley. He changed American music. Everybody considered him to be the real catalyst to so much change. There would be sort of a white rhythm and blue artist who crossed over into the mainstream. He would eventually do this. He would break through. But the guy that really brought people to rock and roll music was Ricky Nelson. We've always heard that those of us that lived it, and we did, the 1950s, I never thought of it as anything but just life. I was too busy going to school, having fun, trying to plan what I was going to do. I was fortunate enough to get a basketball scholarship, so that was taken care of. So whatever was going to work. But we've been told by writers since that the happy days of the 1950s were really not so happy. Now, this was the time when business was merging. We had something called conglomerates. And to really bring the rest of the public along, this is really one of the most important slides in the presentation. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Treaty of Detroit. I taught history for years before I stumbled onto this concept of the Treaty of Detroit. And essentially what it did was to create a truce between business and labor. Labor would stop trying to tell business what to do, and business would then provide labor with what almost appeared to be, you know, kind of a golden bowl, a lifetime job. And you'll notice the concept up there. Henry Ford was the man who really started this idea by paying people $5 a day, which was double anything people were paying back in the 1940s. And the concept is really the virtuous circle of growth, where it just goes around. You make it, you share it with somebody else, and it goes around and builds and grows, and everybody benefits from it. Walter Reuther would say that this agreement between labor and management was labor's passport to the middle class. Now, in the 1950s, there's so much going on. We can't pull all of these into a stream and just follow it chronologically. We've got teenagers, we've got Red Scare, we've got so much going on. We also had the CIA sort of doing its thing. And in 1953, the CIA, with the help of people inside Iran, unseated Mohammad Mossadegh. And as a result, the Iranians have not liked us ever since. After Mossadegh was deposed, we helped put in place the Shah of Iran, who then was the leader of Iran from 1953 until 1979. So you can imagine the animus that must have developed over all those years when you consider the splendor in which the Shah lived and the misery in which so many other people lived, and the use of the Savant, which was his secret police. Not a very happy time in history. We had our 1950s rebels. We can identify these, I think, fairly simply here. Marlon Brando on the left, James Dean. That famous line in the film where, "I can't take it anymore." And on the right, we have an actor that's not nearly as well known and died in a tragic helicopter accident several years ago. It was Vic Morrow. And Vic Morrow was one of the young kids in the Blackboard Jungle. One of the fun things for me when I see that film is that at the very beginning of the film, you see these two guys walking down the stairs on their hands. Well, that was San Pedro High School, where I was a student at the time, and those were two gymnasts. So they had a little bit part in the film. March of Dimes helped us bring an end to polio. We all remember taking that sugar cube, don't we? This is what really changed so much in the United States. New math. Everybody's now got to be a theoretician when it comes to math. Sputnik. And boy, did we have egg on our face when this happened, because the Russians got there first. Now, there are a number of books that were published about life in the 1950s, and I've listed down 2 or 3 of them here. Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 51, that really went after the burning of the books. We have David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd, Sloan Wilson's The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, a wonderful film with Gregory Peck. First television debate. Who do you think won? We all probably heard it. We watched it, that little flickering black and white TV, but there it was, and we were excited. The pros tell us that those that listened to it on the radio thought Nixon won. Those that watched it on TV thought Kennedy won. And that really tells us, gives us the message that how powerful television was becoming and would become. John Kennedy's, were you thrilled by, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. There's another line, by the way, in that inaugural speech that was troubling me. It was troublesome to me. We'll pay any price, bear any burden for the protection of democracy around the world. Who can remember Jackie taking us on a tour of the White House? It was a big, big event. And Eleanor Roosevelt was the first really important first lady. As it went on, each of them would assume the responsibility of taking on a job. Lady Bird Johnson was beautifying America. Nancy Reagan was refurbishing the dish set in the White House. I shouldn't have said that, huh? Now, this is out of sync time-wise, but again, Jackie Robinson, the film, I understand, 42, whatever it's called, is out now, and it's supposed to really be terrific. He was not the best choice to be the person brought in. He was kind of an irascible guy. He was a difficult guy to deal with. You might remember, those of you that lived here in Southern California at the time, baseball wasn't Major League Baseball, it was Pacific Coast League. And we followed our favorite teams, and of course the big competition was between the LA Angels and the Hollywood Stars. And I remember going to Gilmore Field, and one of the great moments of my life was when one of my older mentors took us to a game, one of the first times I'd crossed Pacific Coast Highway in my life, and we went into the dugout, and there's JoJo White, and he shook my hand, and it just engulfed it. I couldn't believe this guy's hand was so huge. Well, Robinson had a difficult time, but he did it well. Branch Rickey told him, look, what I want is a guy who's not going to react. I want a guy who can take it. And that's exactly what Robinson had to do. Now we get into some of the race issue. If you go back in history, our founding fathers were accused of having one major failure in writing the Constitution of the United States, and that was not dealing with the race question with slavery. And slavery has been a part of our lives ever since, and after the war, we finally began to, again, address the issue. There was so much pressure being brought to bear on the government. During the war, many black Americans had moved out of the South into the North, around Chicago, here into Los Angeles, Watts. So the population was reaching out, spreading out, and they were demanding a change. This is Central High, Little Rock, Arkansas. This was the end result of the decision by the United States Supreme Court called Brown versus Board of Education. The 1960s, a nation in turmoil. What a time. Now, in 1964-65, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, signed Medicare into law. We're all beneficiaries of that. Whether we like it or not, it's there. And I think most of us, we're probably glad it is there. We're not so sure about Obamacare, but that's another issue. The pill. This liberated women. Somebody called the pill the beginnings of the sexual revolution, but when you look at statistically, most women were not into that kind of thing. It was a fringe group, and we could see that if we went up to Haight-Ashbury, or if we went to any number of places where counterculture people hung out. But the mainstream, certainly, what this did was to really liberate the woman. The Berlin Wall in 1961. The coming down of that wall, by the way, will be the end of this discussion this morning. The Cuban Missile Crisis, how many of you watched that talk? John Kennedy's on television, and my gosh, people ran out and bought out the stores. Let's get all the canned goods we can. Let's get bottled water. Shortly after that, we had a bomb shelter craze. We had one right across the street from our home in San Pedro back in the 1960s. By the way, this really raised the Kennedy stature and began the downfall of Nikita Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. After this, he was on his way out. Power of the television. Once again, TV is a major part of this presentation because once we get television, it's just everywhere in our lives. It brings the world into our homes. And then we have to experience all the funny things and all of the ugly things. And this is one of the ugly things that we saw. And this would really help push the idea that it was time to do something about addressing the racial issue and justice in the United States. Names that came out of this episode, you might recall the name Bull Connor, who unleashed the dogs and who told those that were attacking the marchers that that the police would be a long time in getting to there, so don't worry about the police interfering. Now, the eternal light, I didn't know whether to use this slide or not. I did, because I didn't want to skip over one of the major events of our time, the death of John Kennedy. My oldest son tells me that his first memory is of that time because I was so depressed. I sat there for hours and hours watching the screen, trying to just understand what was going on. And incredibly, when this happened, he was just 2 years old, but he claims to have a memory of having seen me just sitting there watching this event. Okay, following the death of Kennedy, we see Lyndon Johnson here being sworn in on Air Force One. There's three songs that really stand out in my mind that are so 60s. This is one of them. Barry McGuire's The Eve of Destruction. How many of you have a memory of that sound and that song? Look it up on iTunes, or just, you don't have to buy it. Just hear the first 30 notes, for 30 seconds of the song. It's powerful. It's incredibly, incredibly powerful. And then the next song, this is Betty Friedan, who decided when she was in her kitchen, is this all there is? And decided to write her book, and the women's movement really took off. This is the second women's movement, the second wave. Can you feel the tension in that photograph? Martin Luther King and LBJ. Okay, and obviously they're talking about civil rights. What's really important is that King decided that he had to become anti-war because the war was taking away from the cause of racial equality and civil rights. So this really caused even more trouble between the two of them. Now, somebody talked about being pretty earlier on when we started this thing. I was going to make that comment early, that somebody in the slide would also say, I am pretty. Now, of course, this is nobody but Muhammad Ali, and you can read the quote for yourself. He decided he was not going to go. The greater cause was the cause of racial justice in the United States. He lost his crown as the heavyweight champion of the world and would not be able to fight again for 4 years. Ultimately, and these would have been during his highest grossing years because he was at his peak, ultimately the United States Supreme Court took his position. He was trying to avoid going to Vietnam, claiming that he was a conscientious objector, and the courts eventually agreed with him. Vivid memory from the 1968 Olympics. This is Juan Carlos, after having placed, I believe he placed first in the 100-meter dash, got up on the podium and gave it the famous black salute. Oh, this enraged people around the country, absolutely enraged them. At the time in the United States, there was this Black Power movement, and he was exemplifying that. This song is the second of the three songs that for me really are the 60s. This is that wonderful lyric. It starts with, something's happening here. What it is isn't exactly clear. I would sing it, but I would embarrass myself. There's a man with a gun over there. Chicago, 1968, and this, of course, was the convention. And boy, was that a mess. They had a hearing on the convention, the authorities, and came to the conclusion that the police had rioted against the demonstrators. Woodstock, wow, what a happening. And of course, Janis Joplin. The casualties of the 1960s, there were millions of them. 58,000 Americans lost their lives in Vietnam. The estimates are that between perhaps as many as 2 million plus Vietnamese died in the war. And then some of our really important leaders also fell. And who can cite the source of that quotation? They gave their full measure of devotion. Yes, who said Lincoln? Very good. Lincoln used that. The Lincoln speeches are the best. They're absolutely wonderful. Now, this is just kind of looking back at the 60s as a decade, this montage of a decade, and we can pick up, we've got the Beatles in the middle. Oh, I just love those Flower Children, the counterculture. At some point in their life, our daughter, Marianne, and my daughter ended up living on the corner of Haight-Ashbury. And we kind of had a lot of fun thinking about what happened there so many years before. Lyndon Johnson, just a tragic figure. The picture there of Nixon, to me, is so important because one of the things that I've learned about American politics is that is what really should be the criteria. What should we decide would be the things that would cause us to support one candidate against another? And interestingly enough, a very famous American critic, Walter Lippmann, once said something really interesting about Franklin Roosevelt. He said, Roosevelt has a first-rate temperament and a second-rate intellect. Well, I'm not so sure that's not such a bad one, too. Because maybe temperament is what we really need in our leaders when they face such difficult questions. And then when you take Richard Nixon, who, yes, was so, yes. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that because as a part-time job, I would occasionally work at the racetrack as a pari-mutuel clerk. And I would work harness races. And there was one fellow there that owned a horse, and he named the horse Tricky Dick N. By the way, who gave Nixon that name? Yes?
Dick Tuck?
No? Very good shot, but who gave Nixon that name? Helen Gahagan Douglas. Helen Gahagan Douglas, the candidate that he beat for the United States Senate. He once said that everything about Douglas was red. She was pink all the way down to her underclothes. Awful, awful way to win a political election. And Nixon would pay the price for that because he would carry the bad feelings of the American public, especially those that were in politics in the intellectual set, who never forgave Nixon for some of the unscrupulous things he did. There's one particular something that I just wanted to share with you for a second. It is claimed that when we were very close to coming to a peace agreement in Vietnam in 1968, and Richard Nixon was running against Hubert Humphrey, that Nixon got Charles Chennault's wife to go to Vietnam and have the Vietnamese government hold off on the decision to reach a peace agreement because he felt that would help him win the presidency. Now, I don't know if that can be substantiated, but I think we can find some arguments for it. So there's something about the man's character, and this would be the 13th thing. If you've got temperament, some intellect, and hopefully you've got character. If we've got those three things, I once used a slide in one of my history classes. It showed Harry S. Truman. Who had more character than Harry S. Truman? The guy, what you saw is what you got. What you saw is what you got. It's too bad that doesn't happen today. You again want to honor those that served in the war. The Vietnam Memorial, I haven't seen it in person. I've seen the replica that's been brought around the country. There are 19 names on that wall of young men from San Pedro. And I have a very, very strong memory of one day, it was about 1965 or 6, no, more like 67 or 68. I had a student in class in junior high school that had just graduated from high school. In fact, was out of high school for about a year. And he also had another teacher who was very much involved in the anti-war movement, who told his students at the time, you guys are going to end up fighting the war in Vietnam. Well, on that occasion, we were just leaving school at the end of the day, walking up the stairs, and this young man told my friend, he said, you know what, you were right, I'm going to Vietnam. He's one of the 19. In the 1970s, we needed these laughs because the 1970s were a very, very difficult 10 years. And probably nobody suffered more through the 70s than Jimmy Carter. Carter does not come across well. He's not given the high score for being a great or successful president. He certainly has proven himself a wonderful man after his presidency, but boy, the issues that he had to face, we had the oil crisis, we had something called stagflation, remember that? when wages and inflation were so high. And the traditional way of solving that problem was to cut jobs so that you had less inflation. Nothing worked. It just seemed like it took forever. And what finally wrung us out of this was when Ronald Reagan became president. He had his chief of the Federal Reserve wring that inflation out. And it forced another deep recession on the United States between 1981 and 82. But it worked. A lot of pain, but it took pain at that time to get out of it. I love this story. When Elvis Presley went to the White House and asked Richard Nixon if there was something he could do for him. Well, according to Presley's wife, he had an ulterior motive. He wanted to get from Nixon our narcotics officer's badge. He wanted something from drug enforcement and firearms that he could carry around with him so he could go anywhere he wanted to with a gun and with his drugs. So that seems to have been the ulterior motive. We can't see it in the slide, but notice the dress. We've got that very conservative Richard Nixon, and Presley's in a purple suit. And yeah, this is the year that Elvis Presley went to the White House. It was 1971. Paul Conrad lived up here on the hill. And for me, he made teaching so much easier because I loved his cartoons. And there are some I wish I had that I've been able to access some of them on the internet, but I wanted to be able to just cut and paste and that kind of thing to make it really easy. I've got 2 or 3 that are really among my favorite. This is one of them. Oh, what a tangle web we weave. Isn't that great? It's just a great line. His cartoons just zeroed right in on the issue. I had one of his students in class once. She was taking cartooning lessons from him, and she brought me back the cartoon he said that he was going to use in the Times the day after Richard Nixon had passed. And the cartoon, it was a cartoon of a cemetery. And there were headstones and grass growing and whatnot. And on the cartoon headstone, one of them said, "Here lies, L-I-E-S, Richard M. Nixon." It was a powerful, powerful cartoon. This has got to be etched into our minds. A tragic figure in so many ways. You almost have to have empathy for him because of his life, a very difficult life. You know, his absolute determination to make it, and he made it. But he made it walking on people, climbing on other people, and maybe it just wasn't worth the price. Should Gerald Ford have pardoned him? Well, I tell you, one of the things it cost him to win the presidency the next year, 2 years later. There's no question that people thought that there was a deal, and that his payback would be not winning the presidency. Okay, this slide, in the 70s, of course, it was all about oil prices, gasoline lines, odd, even days. And Jimmy Carter had a solution to the problem. Just turn down the thermostat and put on a sweater. He also had the speed limit dropped to 50 miles per hour. I didn't bring this up earlier on, but the speed limit during World War II was dropped by the government to 35 miles an hour to save gasoline and tires. Someone once referred to Ronald Reagan as the Teflon president. Nothing seemed to stick. Well, this brings us to the end of our program here. This is the flag turned upside down, which means distress. And there's no question that the Soviet Union was in distress. It didn't bring an end. The coming down of the wall in 1989 did not actually close out the Soviet Union. It would actually end up in 1991 when Gorbachev decided to just simply call it quits. The criticisms of Iraq, they go on and on. Again, I'm not here to argue the pros and cons, but there's no question that it raised a lot of minds in people's minds about what happened and why. This slide is kind of a graph of who's responsible in terms of money and the debt. And you can see that red line that's going up there. That's when we moved from Carter in 1970 or 1980 to the end of 2009. That one little glitch there, that one little drop in between was Bill Clinton, when we actually did end up balancing the budget for a time or two. At the very end, I decided to list down what I thought were the 10 real most important events or things that happened during our lifetimes, and I listed them in the order that I thought they were important. I started with the atomic age, which is been with us ever since. And of course, what's happening in Iran and North Korea certainly lend credence to the position of that one. The internet is such a big thing. If we had the internet back when we were young, would our lives have been so much different? DNA. What can you say about DNA? The Genome Project, antibiotics, the end of the Cold War, the pill. AIDS has been such a big part of what's happened since the 1980s. Today it's global warming, whether or not it's real. We've certainly had some really strange weather events over the last year or two. And for some of us, really, the end of cheap energy. We used to fill up our gas tank in my Volkswagen for $3, and now it takes who knows what will be the next price. Questions? Yes. One of the short things we missed was bubble gum. They stopped making bubble gum during World War II. We used to try to make our own. And we try to use something like Scotch tape or whatever. We used to chew the black tar off the street. But one of the local markets actually got bubble gum from who knows where, and we got over there and bought the box and then made a little bit of a profit on it. A little black marketeering here. Yeah, any more questions? Yes. I was reminded that my flippant characterization of Nancy Reagan, her project was just say no. And I do admit that. Just say no to drugs. Well, I have really started this with the idea that we really believe certain things about ourselves as all people do. And one of my favorite characterizations of us as a people is one that I found in a quotation from Black Mask magazine. It begins, vigorous-minded, hard in a square man's hardness, hating unfairness, trickery, injustice, cowardly underhandedness, standing for a square deal and a fair show in little or big things, and willing to fight for them, not squeamish or prudish, but clean, admiring the good in man or woman, not sentimental in a gushing sort of way, but valuing true emotion, not hysterical, but responsive to the thrill of danger, the stirring exhilaration of clean, swift, hard action, always pulling for the right guy to come out on top. Well, thank you very much for your patience in enduring this, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.